I can't come to your surgery, Emma. Madison's Bachelorette weekend is that same day, and I've already committed to going to Miami with her. My mother's voice came through the phone with that particular tone she always used when discussing Madison's plans, bright and animated in a way it never was when she talked to me. I stood in my small kitchen in our Logan Square apartment, my hand gripping the counter so hard my knuckles went white. The phone pressed against my ear as I tried to process what she was actually saying. "Mom, it's cancer," I said, hating how small my voice sounded, hating that I had to explain this, that I had to make my case for why my surgery might warrant her presence. "I know, honey, and I'm sure everything will be fine. You said the doctor was optimistic, right? And you have David. He'll be there with you." The casual dismissiveness in her tone was so familiar it almost didn't hurt anymore, except that it did. It absolutely did. Because this wasn't a college graduation, or a work promotion, or one of 1,000 other moments she'd missed. This was cancer. This was a tumor they were cutting out of my body. This was the kind of thing that mothers were supposed to show up for. The surgery is on a Friday morning. Madison's party doesn't even start until Friday night. You could come to the surgery and fly out later, I heard myself saying. And I despised the pleading note that crept into my voice, the way I was already negotiating, already making it easier for her, already shrinking my needs to fit around Madison's wants. "Emma, don't be selfish. This is Madison's bachelorette party. It's a special weekend. The whole group is flying down together, and I'm not going to be the only mother who misses it. Besides, surgery is just a few hours. You'll be asleep for most of it. You won't even know I'm not there." That sentence landed like a physical blow. You won't even know I'm not there. As if my unconsciousness made her absence acceptable, as if being under anesthesia meant I wouldn't wake up and look for her face, wouldn't feel the emptiness of her missing presence in every moment before and after. I thought about 2 weeks earlier, sitting alone in Dr. Morrison's office at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, the oncologist's kind eyes watching me as he explained the pathology results, the treatment plan, the timeline. I'd asked if I could call my mother, if she could come to the appointment, but she'd been busy helping Madison look at wedding venues. "I can come to the next one," she'd promised, but there hadn't been a next one, not one she'd attended anyway. David had come to every appointment since, taking notes in his careful architect's handwriting, asking the questions I was too scared to ask, holding my hand when the fear threatened to overwhelm me. "Fine," I said into the phone, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Have fun in Miami." "Don't be like that, Emma. You're being dramatic. It's just surgery. You're going to be fine." She hung up before I could respond, probably already mentally packing her swimsuit and planning what she'd post on Facebook about her exciting mother-daughter trip with Madison. I stood there in my kitchen with the phone still against my ear, listening to the dial tone, and I realized this was it. This was the moment I'd remember forever, the moment when I finally understood with perfect clarity that I would never be the daughter she chose, that no matter what happened to me, Madison's happiness would always matter more than my survival. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through my contacts to find Jade's number, and when she answered on the second ring with her usual cheerful, "Hey babe, what's up?" I tried to speak but found the words caught in my throat, and she must have heard something in my silence, because her voice changed immediately, became soft and urgent. "Emma? What's wrong?" "My mom's not coming to my surgery," I managed to say, and saying it out loud made it real, made it true, made it something I could no longer pretend wasn't happening. "She's going to Madison's bachelorette party instead." The thing is, this wasn't new. This pattern of coming second, of being the daughter who could wait, whose milestones could be missed without consequence because I wouldn't make a scene, wouldn't cry or complain, or demand the attention that Madison absorbed like sunlight. I thought about my college graduation from University of Illinois 5 years ago, how I'd sent my mother the date months in advance, how she'd promised she'd be there to watch me walk across that stage with my bachelor's degree in public health. a degree I'd earned while working 20 hours a week to supplement the modest scholarship money. Because unlike Madison, I hadn't received the full parental funding package. But 2 weeks before graduation, Madison had called in tears because her sorority formal was the same weekend, and she desperately needed Mom there to help her get ready, to take photos, to be part of the experience. And just like that, my graduation became negotiable, became something that could be sacrificed. And my mother had called me with that same apologetic but not really apologetic tone to explain that Madison really needed her. And surely I understood. Surely I could see that a formal was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. I'd wanted to scream that a graduation was also once in a lifetime, that I'd worked my ass off for 4 years, that I'd earned this moment, but instead I'd said it was fine, because that's what I always did. I made it easy for her to choose Madison by pretending it didn't hurt. My father had come to that graduation, had driven down from Milwaukee where he'd moved after the divorce, had sat in the crowd and cheered when they called my name, had taken me to dinner afterward at a nice restaurant where he'd tried to fill the space my mother had left empty. But we'd both felt her absence like a missing tooth, something we kept touching with our tongues, unable to ignore the gap. And then there was Madison's wedding 2 years ago, the lavish destination wedding in Cabo San Lucas that my mother had helped plan and fund, writing checks that totaled $45,000 for the venue, the photographer, the flowers, the open bar, the welcome dinner, the farewell brunch, every detail orchestrated to perfection so that Madison could have her dream wedding. When David and I had gotten married 3 years ago in a simple ceremony at a botanical garden in Chicago, my mother had given us $500 in a card with a note that said she hoped it helped, that she wished she could do more, but money was tight, and I'd accepted it with gratitude because I'd learned not to expect equal treatment, had learned that Madison's wants would always outweigh my needs in the complex calculus of my mother's affection. The truth was that I'd built a good life despite the imbalance, despite being the invisible daughter. I had my master's degree in public health from Northwestern, earned while working full-time at a nonprofit health advocacy organization where I'd steadily moved up from program coordinator to senior program manager, making $58,000 a year. Which wasn't much by Chicago standards, but was honest work that mattered. Work that helped people navigate the impossible complexity of healthcare systems. I had David, who I'd met 6 years ago at a mutual friend's dinner party, an architect with a quiet steadiness that had felt like coming home, who saw me in a way my mother never had, who chose me every single day without making it feel like a sacrifice. Meanwhile, Madison had built her life on Instagram filters and sponsorship deals, calling herself an influencer, posting photos of her workouts and her smoothie bowls and her outfits, living in an apartment my parents helped subsidize, dating a string of men who never quite met her standards, financially dependent and emotionally volatile, but always the center of my mother's universe. I'd realized somewhere along the way that I was the easy daughter, the one who didn't require maintenance, who handled her own problems and didn't call crying at midnight and didn't need constant reassurance, and I'd thought that maybe being easy was a virtue, something my mother appreciated even if she didn't express it. But sitting in my kitchen after that phone call about the surgery, I finally understood that being easy had only taught her that I could be ignored. The morning of the surgery arrived with that particular quality of gray light that Chicago does so well in early October, the sky heavy and close, pressing down on the city like a held breath. And I sat in the pre-op area at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, wearing the thin gown they'd given me. David beside me in the plastic chair pulled as close as it would go, his hand wrapped around mine with a steadiness that I tried to absorb into my own trembling body. The nurse had already inserted my IV, the needle taped carefully to the back of my hand, and I kept looking at it, this physical tether to the machinery of survival, thinking about how my mother should be here, how there should be 2 hands holding mine instead of one, how the empty chair on my other side felt like an accusation. David kept up a steady stream of gentle conversation, telling me about a project at work, about something funny our neighbor had said, anything to fill the silence. And I loved him desperately in that moment for understanding that I needed distraction, needed something to focus on besides the fear that sat in my chest like a stone. Carol, David's mother, appeared around the curtain with her familiar warm smile, carrying a small cooler bag that she set carefully beside David's chair. "I made you some soup for when you're feeling up to eating," she said, leaning down to kiss my cheek, and I felt tears prick at my eyes because this woman who had only known me for 3 years had thought about what I might need after surgery, had spent time in her kitchen making something to comfort me, while my own mother was probably at that moment boarding a plane to Miami, posting photos of her airplane breakfast to Facebook. "Your dad called me this morning," Carol said, settling into the empty chair I'd been staring at, and I felt grateful to her for filling that space, for making it less obviously vacant. "He wanted to make sure someone was here with you both." The nurse came to check my vitals, her movements efficient and kind, and she asked the question I'd been dreading. "Is there other family coming? We like to have contact numbers for everyone who'll be in the waiting room." I opened my mouth, the lie forming automatically, years of practice making it smooth and easy. "They're out of town," I said. "It's just David today." The nurse nodded, made a note on her chart, moved on, and I saw something flicker across Carol's face. Some understanding passing between her and David in a look I wasn't supposed to catch, and I knew then that David had told his mother, that Carol knew my own mother had chosen champagne in Miami over holding my hand in this sterile pre-op bay. My phone sat silent on the small table beside the bed. No missed calls, no texts, nothing. And I picked it up anyway, checking one more time because some stupid, childish part of me still believed she might have changed her mind, might have decided at the last moment that her daughter mattered more than Madison's party. But there was only a text from Jade saying she was thinking of me, sending love, that she'd visit as soon as I was up for it. The anesthesiologist came then, introducing himself with a calm professionalism that I found strangely comforting, explaining what would happen, how I'd feel, asking me to count backwards from 10, and David leaned down to kiss me, his eyes bright with worry he was trying to hide, and Carol squeezed my foot through the blanket. And the last coherent thought I had before the drugs pulled me under was a question that felt like a prayer. Is she thinking of me right now, at this exact moment? Does she feel anything at all? I woke to David's face, his relief so naked and immediate that I started crying before I was fully conscious, and he was saying, clean margins, the doctor said clean margins." And I understood through the fog of anesthesia that this meant good news, meant the cancer was contained, meant I would live but would need the aggressive treatment Dr. Morrison had outlined, the chemotherapy and radiation that would consume the next 6 months of my life. My hand fumbled for my phone on instinct, muscle memory, that pathetic need to check if she'd called, and David tried to stop me, but I'd already opened Instagram, already seen the stories, the parade of images from Madison's bachelorette party, and there in the background of a poolside photo, crystal clear and unmistakable, was my mother in a sundress raising a champagne flute to the Miami sunshine, her smile wide and untroubled, celebrating while I woke up alone, except for the family I'd chosen rather than the one I'd been born into. The first 2 weeks of recovery passed in a fog of pain medication and sleep, my body healing in that slow, frustrating way that made me feel trapped inside my own skin. And David took leave from his job at the architecture firm, spending his days bringing me water and adjusting pillows and helping me to the bathroom when the incision pulled too sharply for me to walk on my own. Carol came every single day, sometimes twice a day, arriving with containers of soup and casseroles and soft foods that wouldn't upset my stomach, sitting with me while David ran to the pharmacy or the grocery store, telling me stories about David's childhood that made me smile despite the ache in my chest that wasn't entirely physical. My father called every morning at 8:30, so regular I could set a clock by it, his voice carefully cheerful as he asked about my pain levels and whether I was eating enough. And I could hear the thing he wasn't saying in the pauses between his words, the anger he was trying to contain, because he'd always been careful not to criticize my mother in front of me, even 10 years after their divorce. But something about this had broken through his usual diplomatic silence. 3 days after the surgery, my phone lit up with a text from my mother, and I stared at it for a full minute before opening it, some part of me still hoping for an apology, for acknowledgement, for something that looked like maternal concern. "Hope everything went well," the message said, followed by 3 exclamation points that felt like violence. "Madison's weekend was magical. Talk soon." I read it twice, then 3 times, waiting for the rage to come, and it did come, hot and consuming, making my hands shake as I held the phone. But then something else came after the rage, something colder and more final, a numbness that settled over me like snow. Jade visited on day 5, bringing magazines and fancy tea and a righteous anger on my behalf that felt both validating and exhausting. And she sat on the edge of my bed and said the thing I'd been thinking, but hadn't been able to articulate. "You know this isn't about the surgery, right? This is about every single time she's chosen Madison over you, every time she's made you feel like you don't matter." I nodded, feeling tears slip down my cheeks, and Jade took my hand and said, "You need to set boundaries, Emma. Real ones. Because she's never going to change, and you're going to keep getting hurt if you keep giving her opportunities to hurt you." David brought me lunch on a tray, homemade chicken soup that Carol had dropped off that morning, and he sat with me while I ate, and I could see he wanted to say something, could see him choosing and rejecting words, and finally he just said, "I'm so angry at her I can barely speak." And I loved him for his anger, for feeling on my behalf what I was still learning to feel for myself. The Instagram stories kept coming, a digital record of my mother's priorities, photos of Madison and her friends at dinner, at the pool, on a boat, my mother visible in the backgrounds like photographic evidence of abandonment. And I stopped looking after the first week, but the damage was done. The message was clear. I lay in my bed in our apartment in Lincoln Park, David asleep beside me, Carol's latest casserole in the refrigerator, my father's morning call something I could count on, and I understood with a clarity that felt like grief that I'd spent 29 years begging for crumbs of attention from someone who would never see me as worth a full meal. And somewhere in that understanding, in that dark bedroom with my healing body and my breaking heart, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done begging. The treatment began 3 weeks after surgery, and the next 6 months became a blur of chemotherapy sessions every other Tuesday at the oncology center on the 8th floor of Northwestern Memorial. The radiation appointments that followed 6 weeks later, like clockwork every afternoon at 3. And through it all, I felt my body becoming something foreign and rebellious, my hair falling out in clumps that I found on my pillow and in the shower drain until David finally helped me shave what was left. His hands gentle and his eyes wet with tears he wouldn't let fall. My mother came to visit exactly once during those 6 months, arriving at our apartment on a Saturday afternoon in November with a plant I was allergic to and staying for precisely 30 minutes before she complained about how expensive parking was in our neighborhood and said she needed to get going. And I watched her leave with something like detachment, a scientist observing an experiment, noting that I felt less hurt than I expected and wondering what that meant. She texted occasionally, messages that said, "Thinking of you," with heart emojis, but never asked specific questions about my treatment or how I was actually feeling. And meanwhile, her Facebook page became a running documentary of Madison's wedding planning, photos of cake tastings and dress fittings and floral arrangements, her captions effusive with excitement about my baby girl's special day. And I stopped looking after a while because what was the point? The invitation to participate in the wedding planning never came, and when I finally asked my mother about it in a moment of weakness during one of her brief phone calls, she said, "Oh, honey, you need to focus on getting better. We didn't want to overwhelm you." As if exclusion was a form of care, as if I wasn't capable of choosing for myself what I could handle. It was during my fourth chemotherapy session, sitting in the infusion chair with poison dripping into my veins, and David beside me reading work emails on his laptop, that I started really looking around at the other patients, seeing the ones who sat alone without anyone holding their hands, the elderly woman across from me whose daughter apparently worked and couldn't get time off, the young man about my age whose family lived in another state. And I started thinking about the gaps in the system, about how cancer treatment assumes you have people and resources and the ability to advocate for yourself when you're at your weakest. I'd brought my own laptop, thinking I'd watch Netflix or browse social media to pass the 3 hours. But instead, I opened a blank document and started taking notes, observations about what patients needed beyond medical treatment, the practical supports that would make an impossible situation slightly more bearable. And by the time my session ended, I had 3 pages of ideas. Dr. Sarah Chen stopped by during my fifth session, this brilliant oncologist I'd met briefly during my surgery consultation, and she saw me typing away and asked what I was working on. And when I explained my thoughts about patient support systems, her eyes lit up with recognition, and she pulled up a chair and we talked for 45 minutes about gaps in care and program design, and the research that showed better outcomes for patients with comprehensive support. She gave me her email address, told me to send her what I'd written, said there was real need for this kind of thinking, and I left that day feeling something I hadn't felt in months: purposeful. David noticed the change in me immediately, the way I started bringing notebooks to appointments, the way I spent my rest days between treatments researching grant programs and best practices, and writing drafts of program proposals. And one night he looked up from his dinner and said, "You're building something, aren't you?" And I realized I was. I was building something in the ruins of my old life, something that mattered, something that existed entirely separate from my mother's approval or attention, and the thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The realization came slowly, like watching the sun rise. But by my last radiation appointment in March, I understood with perfect clarity that I'd spent 29 years seeking validation from someone who was fundamentally incapable of giving it. Not because I was unworthy, but because she couldn't see worth in anything that didn't reflect her own priorities. And I could either keep performing for an audience that would never applaud, or I could build a life for people who actually saw me. And sitting there in that radiation waiting room with my skin burned and my body exhausted and my mind clearer than it had been in years, I chose myself. Dr. Chen called me into her office on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, the spring light coming through her window in a way that felt symbolic, though I tried not to read too much into it. And she smiled before she spoke, which told me everything I needed to know. And when she said the word remission, I felt David's hand tighten around mine, and I nodded because I couldn't speak, couldn't process that my body had cooperated, that I'd made it through to the other side. And she talked about monitoring and follow-up appointments and staying vigilant, but the essential truth was that I'd survived, and I walked out of Northwestern Memorial into the April air, feeling simultaneously light and heavy, grateful and angry, alive and grieving for the year I'd lost. My mother called that evening, and I knew she'd somehow heard the news, probably from my father who still spoke to her occasionally, despite their decade-old divorce, and I braced myself for her response as I answered, and her first words after, "That's wonderful, honey," were, "So you'll be able to come to Madison's wedding then?" Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "I'm so relieved." Not, "I should have been there." Just immediate pivot to Madison and whether my survival meant I could fulfill my obligation as a guest at the event that had been orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign for the past 8 months while I'd been fighting for my life. I said yes, I'd be there, because what else could I say? And she launched into details about the timeline and the dress code and how excited Madison was. And I held the phone away from my ear and looked at David, who was watching me with concern and something like fury, and I felt nothing, which was somehow worse than feeling hurt. The wedding was 2 weeks later at the Four Seasons, and Madison had chosen late May for maximum photo opportunities. The city in bloom, the weather reliably warm, and the whole affair had reportedly cost $45,000, the same amount my mother had spent on Madison's entire wedding while giving me $500 for mine 3 years earlier. And I tried not to think about the symbolism as David and I got ready in our apartment, me in an emerald dress we'd chosen together at a boutique in Lincoln Park. The color making my pale skin look less sickly, and working with my short hair that was just starting to grow back in soft dark curls that were nothing like my original straight hair. My body apparently deciding to reinvent itself along with my life. We arrived at the Four Seasons, and I felt underdressed despite the expensive dress. Felt small despite having survived something Madison couldn't imagine. And my mother greeted us in the lobby with air kisses and a quick up and down glance at my hair that said everything about her disappointment, that I didn't look normal yet, didn't look like the daughter she could show off. And she immediately turned to greet other guests, more important guests. And David put his hand on my lower back, in that way he had of anchoring me when I felt like I might float away. The reception hall was obscenely beautiful, 300 guests seated at tables with centerpieces that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and I found my name card at table 24, far from the family tables up front, seated with distant cousins I'd met maybe twice in my life, cousins who looked confused about why they were at this wedding at all. And David found his card next to mine, and I watched him swallow whatever he wanted to say about the seating arrangement, watched him choose to be present for me instead of angry on my behalf, and I loved him for that choice. Madison looked beautiful, objectively stunning in a dress that had required 3 fittings and endless discussions about lace patterns, and my mother orbited her like a moon, adjusting her train and touching up her makeup and basking in the reflected glow of her golden child's perfect day, and I sat at table 24 and watched and felt the last threads of something break inside me, not painfully but cleanly, like a surgical cut. The maid of honor speech came during dinner, Madison's best friend from college talking about their sorority days, and Madison's generous spirit, and her perfect love story. And then she turned to my mother and said, "I have to give special thanks to Madison's mom, who has been there for everything important, every step of the way, the most devoted mother I've ever seen." And 300 guests turned to look at my mother, who stood and waved and dabbed at her eyes, and I watched her beam with pride and recognition, watched her soak up the public acknowledgement of her maternal devotion, and I felt David's hand find mine under the table and squeeze hard, and I squeezed back, and something that had been straining inside me for 29 years finally, mercifully, let go, and I understood with perfect clarity that I was done performing for an audience that would never applaud, done auditioning for a role I would never be cast in, done believing that if I just achieved enough, or suffered enough, or needed her badly enough, she would finally see me. And I sat at table 24 in my emerald dress, with my cancer short hair, and my husband's hand in mine, and I felt something like freedom, cold and clean and absolutely final. I waited exactly 1 week after Madison's wedding, letting the dust settle and my thoughts crystallize into something clear and unshakable, and on a Tuesday morning in early June, I sat at our kitchen table with sunlight coming through the window and my phone in my hand, and I called my mother, and she answered on the 3rd ring with her usual breezy tone, asking how I was doing, and I didn't bother with small talk. I just said, "Mom, I need to talk to you about our relationship." And I heard her sigh, that particular sigh that meant she thought I was being difficult, and she said, "Emma, if this is about the seating at the wedding, the venue had very specific limitations." And I said, "It's not about the seating, it's about everything. It's about a pattern that I can't participate in anymore." And there was silence on the other end. And then she said, "You're being dramatic," in that dismissive way she had perfected over 29 years, the tone that made me feel like my feelings were inconvenient weather she had to endure. And I had prepared for this, had actually written notes that sat in front of me on the table, though I found I didn't need them because the words came clear and calm, and I said, "I'm stepping back from our relationship for my own emotional health. I need to preserve myself and stop seeking something you can't or won't give me." And I heard her sharp intake of breath, and then her voice changed, got harder, And she said, "After everything I've done for you?" And I almost laughed at the script of it, the predictability, and I said, "What have you done for me specifically in the last year?" And she started listing things, generic things like, "I've always been there, and I raised you," and I let her finish. And then I said very quietly, "You weren't there for my cancer surgery. You visited once during 6 months of treatment for 30 minutes and complained about parking. You seated me at table 24 at Madison's wedding with people I barely know. You've called me exactly 4 times in the past year, and 3 of those calls were about Madison." And the silence that followed was different, tighter. And then she said, "Madison needed me for her wedding. It was the most important day of her life. And you had David. You've always been fine on your own." And I felt something click into place. The final piece of understanding that she genuinely believed this, genuinely saw no problem with her logic. And I said, "I wasn't fine. I was scared and sick and alone, and the fact that I survived without you doesn't mean I should have had to." And she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "So what do you want from me?" And I said, "Nothing anymore. That's the point. I'm not asking you to change or be different. I'm just telling you that I'm going to attend major family events, but I'm not going to call you for support or expect you to show up for me or keep trying to have the relationship I needed when I was a child." And her voice rose, got sharp with anger, and she said, "So you're punishing me. You're going to freeze me out because I'm not perfect." And I said, "I'm not punishing you. I'm protecting myself. There's a difference." And she tried guilt then, her voice breaking as she said, "I can't believe you would do this to me after everything with Madison's wedding and planning and stress." And I felt nothing, no guilt, no softening, just clarity. And I said, "I need to go. I hope you can understand eventually." And she said, "Fine, be that way, cut me off, see if I care." And I said, "Okay," and hung up. And I sat there at the kitchen table with my phone in my hand, and David came in from the bedroom where he'd been giving me privacy, and he looked at me with concern and asked if I was okay. And I realized I was. I was better than okay. I felt light and clear and free in a way I'd never felt before. And I said, "I think I just saved my own life for the second time." And he pulled me into his arms, and I let myself rest there, knowing I'd done the hardest and most necessary thing, knowing I'd finally chosen myself. 18 months after the boundary conversation, I found myself in a version of my life I hadn't imagined possible during those dark treatment days. A life built not around seeking approval, but around creating meaning. And the transformation hadn't been dramatic or sudden, but rather a steady accumulation of small choices to invest my energy where it would actually grow something. The patient support program I'd begun drafting in my hospital chair during chemotherapy had caught the attention of the administration at Northwestern Memorial, and Dr. Chen had championed it with the kind of fierce advocacy I'd needed from my mother, but had found instead in this brilliant woman who barely knew me. And together we'd developed a pilot program that launched at 3 Chicago hospitals in January, providing newly diagnosed cancer patients with practical support like meal delivery and transportation and childcare arrangements, but also emotional support through peer mentoring and therapy connections and support groups that met people where they were rather than where we wished they'd be. I wrote academic papers about the gaps in patient care systems, about how medical excellence meant nothing if patients couldn't actually access it or survive the non-medical devastation of serious illness, and I presented at conferences where I stood in front of researchers and administrators and told them about sitting alone in pre-op while my mother raised champagne glasses in Miami. And I watched their faces change as they understood that this wasn't abstract theory, but lived experience translated into systemic solution. My nonprofit promoted me to Director of Patient Advocacy in March, with a salary increase to $85,000, more money than I'd ever made. Enough that David and I started seriously looking at houses instead of just dreaming, and the work was hard and emotionally demanding, but it felt like breathing after years of holding my breath. Felt like finally using parts of myself that had atrophied from disuse. My mother called occasionally, maybe once every 6 weeks, and the conversations followed a predictable pattern where she'd ask how I was doing in a tone that suggested she was checking a box. And then she'd launch into updates about Madison, who was pregnant now, and planning an elaborate nursery, and experiencing morning sickness that required daily phone calls and sympathy. Or she'd complain about her own problems with her book club, or her neighbor's tree that blocked her view, or her book club friend who'd said something mildly critical. And I'd make appropriate sounds and keep the calls short and feel nothing, which was such an improvement over feeling everything that I considered it a victory. I maintained my boundaries with consistent politeness, attending family events when required, but arriving late and leaving early, responding to texts within 24 hours, but never initiating contact, being cordial, but never vulnerable. And she seemed not to notice the wall I'd built, or perhaps she preferred it this way, preferred a daughter who didn't need anything, and therefore didn't inconvenience her with uncomfortable requests for basic maternal care. David's career flourished in parallel to mine, a new position at a prestigious architecture firm that valued his innovative designs and his ability to translate client dreams into structural reality. And in May, we closed on a small brick house in Oak Park with a garden that needed work and rooms that needed paint and a future that felt entirely ours. And we spent weekends stripping wallpaper and choosing paint colors and planting herbs in the garden. And Carol came over with her expertise and her endless patience and taught me how to prune roses and stake tomatoes. And my father visited with his new girlfriend Helen, who was kind and funny and nothing like my mother. And Jade brought wine and helped me paint the bedroom a soft gray that David had designed. And I realized one Saturday afternoon while covered in paint and surrounded by people who'd chosen to show up for me that I'd built the life I wanted, not the life I thought would finally make my mother see me. And the difference between those two things was everything. Was the difference between performing and living, between seeking validation and generating it from within. And I was finally, remarkably, doing the latter. 2.5 years after the surgery that my mother had missed for champagne and party favors in Miami, I was sitting in my office at the nonprofit on a Tuesday morning in October when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and I almost let it go to voicemail because I was deep in budget reports. But something made me answer, and the voice on the other end introduced herself as Rebecca Morrison from the Hawthorne Foundation. And she said, "I'm calling to inform you that your Comprehensive Cancer Patient Support Program has been selected to receive a $2.3 million grant." And I had to ask her to repeat it because the number didn't make sense. Couldn't be real. And she laughed warmly and said it again, $2.3 million over 3 years to implement my program across 15 hospitals throughout Illinois. And I sat there with my hands shaking and tears starting to blur my vision as she continued talking about timelines and implementation phases, and how the selection committee had been unanimous in their enthusiasm for my approach. And after I hung up, I just sat there for a long moment, staring at my computer screen, not seeing anything, feeling this immense wave of validation and disbelief and triumph wash over me. And then I called David, who shouted so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. And then I called Dr. Chen, who said, "I knew it. I absolutely knew they'd choose you." And then I called my father, who started crying before I even finished the sentence, his voice breaking as he said, "Emma, sweetheart, I always knew you were extraordinary. I always knew you'd do something that mattered." And I cried too, because this was what parental pride sounded like, and it had been there all along from him, just not from the parent I'd spent my childhood desperately trying to impress. The news moved fast after that. The foundation issued a press release that the Chicago Tribune picked up, running a feature article about my program and my personal story that included a photo of me in my office and quotes from Dr. Chen about the innovative approach and measurable outcomes. And a local TV station called requesting an interview. And suddenly I was sitting under bright lights in a studio, explaining how my own cancer experience had revealed the gaps in patient support systems, how people were surviving the disease but being destroyed by everything around it, the loss of income, and the transportation barriers, and the emotional isolation, and the practical impossibilities of managing normal life while your body was being systematically poisoned in the name of healing. And I talked about how the $2.3 million would fund care coordinators and transportation services and meal programs and support groups across 15 hospitals, reaching an estimated 5,000 patients in the first year alone. And the interviewer asked what this moment meant to me, and I said, "It means that other people won't have to go through treatment feeling as alone as I did." And I didn't mention my mother because she wasn't part of this story anymore, wasn't part of the narrative of my success or my purpose. Jade organized a celebration dinner at our favorite restaurant with David and Carol and my father and Helen and close friends from work. And we raised glasses to the grant and to the future and to the strange gift of cancer, showing me who I really was. And my father stood up and made a toast about watching me transform pain into purpose, and how proud he was to be my dad. And I felt surrounded by people who'd chosen to show up for my life without obligation or guilt or performance, people who saw me clearly and loved what they saw. And later that night, when I finally sat down to send my mother a text because it felt wrong for her to hear about it from someone else, I wrote simply, "My patient support program received a $2.3 million grant, will be implemented across 15 hospitals in Illinois." And her response came 40 minutes later. "That's nice, honey. Madison's baby shower is next month. Are you coming?" And I stared at those words for a long time, this perfect encapsulation of everything that would never change. And then I put my phone down and looked around at the life I'd built in the shadows of her indifference, and I understood with crystalline clarity that this moment, this achievement, this validation meant more because I'd earned it without her attention or approval, meant more because I'd built it for the right reasons, rather than as another desperate bid for her to finally see me. And I texted back, "I'll check my calendar and let you know." And then I deleted the thread and went to find David, because I wanted to be with someone who actually celebrated my victories instead of using them as transitions to talk about my sister. 3 years after my mother had chosen champagne in Miami over holding my hand through cancer surgery, I got a phone call that I should have expected, but still somehow caught me off guard. And it was her voice on the other end, but different than usual, frantic and high-pitched, in a way that immediately signaled crisis. And she said, "Emma, I need you to help your sister. Madison's marriage is falling apart and she's in serious trouble." And I stood in my kitchen, holding a coffee mug, and feeling absolutely nothing, while she continued talking about how Madison's husband Jake had discovered secret credit card debt, $67,000, that Madison had hidden from him in accounts he didn't know existed, all of it spent on clothes and furniture and trips and God knows what else. And he'd moved out 3 days ago and filed for divorce, and Madison was hysterical and pregnant and completely falling apart. And my mother's expectation was clear in her tone, even before she said it directly. "You need to help her, Emma. You're doing so well now, and Madison needs someone to step in." And I took a sip of my coffee and said very calmly, "Help her how?" And there was this pause, like my mother couldn't believe I was asking. And then she said, "Well, financially, obviously. You have that big grant now, and Madison needs someone to help her get back on her feet." And I felt something cold and clear settle over me as I realized she actually expected me to hand over money to fix the golden child's mess. Expected me to rescue Madison from consequences, the same way our mother had been rescuing her from consequences her entire life. And I said, "Mom, I can't do that. The grant money isn't mine personally, and even if it were, giving Madison money wouldn't help her. It would just enable her to avoid dealing with the real problem." And my mother's voice shifted into that tone I knew so well, the guilt trip tone, the "how dare you deny your family" tone. And she said, "I cannot believe you would be so selfish when your sister is in crisis, after everything we've been through as a family." And I almost laughed at that phrase, "everything we've been through as a family," because what exactly had we been through together when she'd missed my cancer surgery for a bachelorette party? And I said, "Madison needs to handle this herself. She needs to face what she's done and make changes. And me giving her money would just delay that." And my mother hung up on me. Actually hung up. And I stood there holding my phone and feeling sad but also clear. And 20 minutes later, my phone rang again, and this time it was Madison, her voice thick with tears, saying, "Emma, please. I know we haven't been close, but I'm desperate. Jake left me, and Mom said you might be able to loan me some money just to get through the next few months, just until I figure things out." And I felt compassion for her, genuine compassion, because I knew what desperation felt like, even if the circumstances were different. But I also knew with absolute certainty that giving her money would be the worst thing I could do. And I said, "Madison, I can't give you money, but I can help you find a financial counselor, someone who specializes in debt management and spending issues, someone who can actually help you address what's going on." And there was silence. And then her voice changed, became sharp and accusing, and she said, "You're enjoying this, aren't you? Seeing me struggle. You've always been jealous of me, and now you finally get to feel superior." And I felt the old instinct to defend myself, to explain, to fix her emotions, but instead I just said very quietly, "I hope you get the help you need, Madison. I really do." And I ended the call and sat down at my kitchen table and put my head in my hands. And David came in from his home office and wrapped his arms around me without saying anything. And I leaned into him and felt sad for my sister, and sad for the family dynamics that had created this mess. But I also felt clear and certain that I'd done the right thing, that the old Emma would have bankrupted herself emotionally and probably financially trying to fix Madison's crisis, while Madison learned nothing, and my mother praised her for being such a caring sister. But this Emma knew better, knew that love sometimes meant letting people face their own consequences. And I sat there in David's arms knowing I'd disappointed my mother, and probably confirmed every terrible thing Madison was thinking about me. But I also knew I'd protected myself and respected Madison enough to not treat her like a child who couldn't handle her own life. And that was growth. Painful and uncomfortable, but real. And I was grateful for the clarity that 3 years of building my own life had given me. The Illinois Healthcare Innovation Award ceremony was scheduled for a Thursday evening in April at the Drake Hotel in downtown Chicago, and I'd received the nomination letter from Dr. Chen 6 weeks earlier with a note that said, "This is exactly the recognition you deserve." And I'd sat with that letter for a long time, feeling something unfamiliar that I eventually recognized as pride. Not the desperate seeking approval kind, but the quiet, earned kind that came from knowing I'd built something real and meaningful. And David had insisted on buying a new suit for the occasion, charcoal gray that made him look distinguished and proud. And Carol had called to ask what I was wearing so she could coordinate, which made me tear up because this was what family support looked like, people making effort without being asked. And my father had driven in from Springfield with Helen, his voice shaking with excitement when he called to confirm the details. And the night of the ceremony, I stood in front of the mirror in my bedroom, wearing a deep blue dress that David had helped me choose, my hair now grown back to shoulder length and healthy. And I looked at my reflection and saw someone I'd fought hard to become, someone who'd survived cancer and indifference and had turned both into purpose. And we arrived at the Drake to find the ballroom filled with doctors and hospital administrators and healthcare executives, all these people who'd spent their careers saving lives and improving systems. And I felt simultaneously honored to be among them and slightly terrified that I didn't belong. But David squeezed my hand and whispered, "You earned this." And I believed him. The ceremony began with a reception where I stood with David and Carol and my father and Helen, and Dr. Chen found us and introduced me to colleagues who'd read my papers and heard about my program, and they talked about scalability and outcomes and implementation challenges with genuine interest, treating me like a peer rather than someone's daughter or someone's wife, just Emma who'd built something worth building. And when we moved into the ballroom for dinner and the award presentations, I sat at a table with my family while the MC talked through various categories. And then they reached healthcare innovation, and they showed a video about my program, images of the care coordinators I'd hired and the patients we'd served, and statistics about improved outcomes and reduced emergency room visits and increased treatment completion rates.
And the narrator's voice explained how my program had served over 2,000 patients in its first 18 months across 15 hospitals. How it had become a model for addressing the non-medical barriers that determined whether people survived cancer. And I sat there watching my work displayed on enormous screens while 200 people paid attention. And then they announced my name, and the room erupted in applause, and I walked to the stage feeling dreamlike and focused all at once. And I accepted the Crystal Award and the ceremonial check for $50,000, and I stood at the podium looking out at all these faces, and I said, 3 years ago I was diagnosed with cancer, and I went through surgery and treatment largely alone.
Not because I didn't have people who loved me, but because our healthcare system doesn't recognize that surviving cancer requires more than medical intervention. It requires someone to drive you to appointments and bring you food when you're too sick to cook and sit with you when you're terrified. And I built this program because no one should have to face cancer feeling as isolated as I did. And I thanked David and Dr. Chen and my team and my father. And then I said something I hadn't planned. I also want to thank my cancer diagnosis for showing me who I really was, for stripping away everything performative and revealing what mattered. And the room gave me a standing ovation, and I stood there with tears running down my face, feeling seen in a way I'd never felt seen before, not as the invisible daughter or the easy child, but as Emma, who'd turned her worst experience into something that helped thousands of people. And afterward, there were photos and interviews and people wanting to talk about replicating the program in their states. And Modern Healthcare magazine asked to do a feature article. And through it all, David stayed close with his hand on my back. And my father kept crying and hugging me and saying, "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart." And I realized that this moment, this recognition, meant everything because I'd earned it honestly, built it from pain and purpose rather than from desperate seeking of approval. And when we finally left the Drake at nearly midnight and stood on the sidewalk waiting for the valet, I looked up at the Chicago skyline and understood with perfect clarity that I wasn't the invisible daughter anymore. I was the woman who'd turned abandonment into architecture, who'd built a life and a legacy that mattered. And that transformation was mine, regardless of who in my family acknowledged it. The call came from my mother on a Tuesday afternoon 2 weeks after the award ceremony, and I was in my office reviewing applications for new care coordinator positions when her name appeared on my phone screen, and I almost didn't answer because we'd settled into a pattern over the past 3 years where she called maybe once every few months with something superficial, and I responded politely but briefly. But something made me pick up, and her voice was different, strained and urgent, and she said, "Emma, I need to talk to you about something. Can you meet me for coffee?" And I said, "What's this about?" And she said, "I just need to see you, please." And there was something in her tone that made me curious more than anything else, so I agreed to meet her that Thursday at a Starbucks near her house in Naperville. And when I arrived, she was already sitting at a corner table with 2 untouched lattes in front of her, and she looked older than I remembered, more fragile somehow, and she stood when she saw me and tried to hug me, but I kept it brief and sat down across from her, and she pushed one of the lattes toward me and said, "I got your usual vanilla latte with extra foam." And I was surprised she remembered but didn't say anything, and there was this long, awkward silence before she finally said, "I saw the article in Modern Healthcare. Karen from church brought it to book club and showed everyone." And I understood immediately what this was about. Not pride in my accomplishment, but the social consequences of her absence during my cancer. And she continued, "Emma, why didn't you tell me it was this serious? Why didn't you explain what you were going through?" And I felt exhaustion wash over me, bone deep and familiar. And I said very quietly, "I did tell you, Mom, multiple times. I told you I had cancer and needed surgery, and you said you couldn't come because of Madison's bachelorette party." And she shook her head like she was trying to physically reject this version of events, and said, "But you told me you were fine. You said David would be there and you'd be okay." And I pulled out my phone and scrolled back 3 years to those text messages that I'd never deleted.
The ones I'd read and reread during treatment when I needed to remind myself that I wasn't crazy or oversensitive, and I read them aloud in the middle of that Starbucks. Mom, I'm scared. The surgery is next week and they said there's a chance it's spread. And her response, You're so strong, honey. You'll get through this. And then my message, I really need you there. Can you please reconsider? And her response, Madison is counting on me for this weekend, you understand? David will take good care of you. And I watched my mother's face as I read these back to her, watched her try to find some interpretation that didn't make her the villain, and she said, I didn't realize. I thought you were just being dramatic. And I said, dramatic about cancer? And she flinched. And then her face crumpled, and she started crying and said, I'm a terrible mother. I know I am. Everyone at church was looking at me when Karen showed them that article, and I could see what they were thinking. And there it was. The real issue. Not that she'd hurt me, but that people knew she'd hurt me. Not the abandonment, but the optics of abandonment. And she reached across the table for my hand, but I pulled back and said, Mom, I can't have this conversation right now. And she said, Please, Emma, I need you to understand. I was overwhelmed with Madison's wedding, and I just didn't think. And I stood up and said, That's the problem. You didn't think about me then, and honestly, I don't think you're thinking about me now either.
You're thinking about how you look to your friends. And I walked out of that Starbucks leaving my untouched latte on the table and my mother crying into her hands. And I sat in my car for 10 minutes feeling empty and sad, but also clear, because this conversation confirmed what I'd suspected for 3 years, that my mother wasn't capable of the kind of reflection or genuine remorse that could repair what had been broken. And I drove home to David and told him about the coffee meeting, and he held me while I cried not for what I'd lost, but for what I'd never really had in the first place. The phone calls started 3 days after our coffee shop confrontation, my mother leaving voicemails that began with just checking in and evolved into longer messages about how she'd been doing some thinking and realized some things. And I listened to them with David sitting beside me on our couch in the Oak Park house, both of us recognizing the pattern of someone trying to manage their image rather than genuinely grapple with their behavior. And then came the text messages, suddenly frequent after years of silence, messages that said, Saw an article about cancer support programs and thought of you, so proud, and thinking about you today, sweetheart. And my personal favorite, you've always been so strong and accomplished. I hope you know how proud I am. And I showed these to Jade over lunch, and she actually laughed and said, Where was this energy 3 years ago when you were literally fighting for your life? And I appreciated her anger on my behalf, even as I felt mostly exhausted by the whole performance. And then my mother started sharing my articles on Facebook, the ones from Modern Healthcare and the Chicago Tribune, posting them with captions like, My brilliant daughter is changing healthcare, and tagging me even though we weren't Facebook friends and hadn't been for 2 years. And I got messages from distant relatives saying, Your mom is so proud of you. She won't stop talking about your achievements. And I wanted to respond, Funny how she discovered these achievements only after her church friends found out she abandoned me during cancer treatment. But instead, I just thanked them politely, and then she started inviting herself to things, calling to ask when she could stop by and see the new house, even though we'd lived there for 8 months, and she'd never expressed interest before. And one Saturday afternoon, she simply showed up unannounced with flowers, pink roses that she knew I didn't particularly like, but that she'd always preferred, and David answered the door, and I heard him say very politely but firmly, Barbara, Emma and I have plans this afternoon. You can't just drop by without calling first. And I came to the door and saw my mother standing on our porch looking smaller and older than I remembered, holding those roses like an offering. And she said, I just wanted to see you, to see how you're doing. And I said, You need to call first, Mom. We're not available for unexpected visits. And I saw hurt flash across her face. But I also saw calculation, the recognition that her usual tactics weren't working, and she said, Can we at least schedule coffee? Please, Emma, I really want to talk. And David and I exchanged a look, and I said, Fine, next Thursday at 2, the Starbucks on North Avenue. And she nodded eagerly and tried to hand me the flowers, but I said, I'll see you Thursday, and closed the door, and and David hugged me and said, "You okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I just need her to understand that access to me is no longer automatic." And Thursday came, and we met at Starbucks, and this time I got there after her deliberately, maintaining control of the situation, and she'd dressed carefully like she was going to church. And when I sat down, she immediately launched into what was clearly a prepared speech about wanting to make things right and be the mother you deserve. And I let her finish, and then I said very calmly, "What does making things right look like to you?" And she faltered and said, "I want to be there for you. I want to support you." And I said, "Mom, where was this desire 3 years ago, or 2 years ago, or even 1 year ago? Why now?" And she said, "I didn't realize how hurt you were." And I said, "Or you didn't realize other people knew how hurt I was." And she flinched but didn't deny it. And then she started crying and said, "What can I do? Emma, please tell me what I can do." And I sat there looking at this woman who'd given birth to me and raised me and somehow never really seen me. And I felt sad but also clear. And I said, "Mom, I don't need you to be there anymore. I needed you 3 years ago when I was terrified and sick and alone. I've built a life now that works without you at the center of it." And she said, "But I'm your mother." Like that was an argument. And I said, "Yes, and I'm your daughter. And for 3 years you've barely noticed me except when Madison needed something or when it was convenient for you. And now that your friends know what happened, you suddenly want to repair our relationship. But I don't know if there's anything to repair, because I don't know if we ever had what you think we had." And we sat there in that Starbucks while other people ordered lattes and worked on laptops and had normal mother-daughter conversations. And finally, my mother said, "I don't know how to fix this." And I said, "I don't know if you can." And I left her sitting there with her untouched coffee, and I drove home feeling not triumphant or vindicated, but simply tired. Tired of being the one who had to explain and justify and prove her worth. And when I got home, David was working in his study, and I stood in the doorway and said, "I think I'm done trying with her." And he said, "That's okay. You've tried enough for a lifetime." And I realized that the permission I'd been seeking to let go of this relationship didn't need to come from my mother. It came from me. Madison's name appeared on my phone 3 weeks after my last conversation with our mother, and I stared at it for a long moment before answering because we hadn't spoken directly in almost 6 months. Not since that brief, awkward exchange at Christmas, where she'd asked about my work and I'd given polite, minimal answers. And when I picked up, she said, "Emma, can we meet for coffee? I know I don't have the right to ask, but I really need to talk to you." And there was something different in her voice, something raw and uncertain that made me say yes despite my instinct to protect myself. And we agreed to meet that Saturday at a cafe in Lincoln Park, neutral territory between our neighborhoods. And when I arrived, she was already there looking so different from the polished Instagram version of herself I was used to seeing. Her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, minimal makeup, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of the designer clothes she used to favor. And she stood when she saw me and said, "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." And we sat down across from each other, and there was this tense silence before she said, "I'm in therapy now, have been for 4 months, and I've been working through a lot of stuff about our family, and I owe you an apology." And I felt myself tense because I'd heard performative apologies before, but she continued, "I know I was complicit in how Mom treated you. I know I took advantage of being the favorite, and I never stood up for you when I should have, and I'm so sorry, Emma. I'm sorry for the bachelorette party and the wedding and every time I let Mom center everything around me while you were invisible." And I watched her carefully, trying to gauge if this was genuine or another manipulation. And she said, "My therapist helped me see how toxic our family dynamic was, how Mom pitted us against each other instead of helping us be sisters, and I participated in that. I benefited from it, and you paid the price." And her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away, and I said quietly, "Why now, Madison? What changed?" And she said, "My divorce, losing everything. It made me look at my life and realize I didn't actually have anything real, no genuine relationships,
No sense of self outside of being the pretty one, the favorite one. And I thought about you building this incredible career while dealing with cancer, and I wasn't even there. I didn't even call you during treatment, Emma. What kind of person does that make me? And I felt something shift in my chest, a tiny crack in the armor I'd built. And I said, "You were the person Mom raised you to be." And she shook her head and said, "That's not an excuse. We both had the same mother, but you found a way to be decent and kind, and I didn't, and I want to be better. I want to actually know my sister if you'll let me." And we sat there while the cafe buzzed around us, and I said, "I don't know if I can trust you yet." And she said, "I understand. I don't trust myself yet either, but I want to try." And then she told me about Mom's situation. How our father was getting remarried to a woman he'd been dating for 2 years, and how Mom was spiraling about it. How her church friends had been asking pointed questions about why she wasn't at my award ceremony, and Madison said, "She's desperate and lonely, and I think she's starting to realize what she lost. But Emma, I'm not telling you this so you'll forgive her. I'm telling you because you deserve to know what's driving her sudden interest." And I appreciated that distinction. And we talked for 2 hours about our childhood and the different ways we'd both been damaged by the same system. And I watched Madison take genuine responsibility without deflecting or making excuses. And when we finally stood to leave, she said, "I know I can't fix the past, but I'd really like to know the real you, not the sister I never bothered to see." And I said, "I'd like that too, but it has to be real Madison. No performance, no going back to old patterns." And she nodded, and we hugged briefly, and it felt tentative, but honest. And driving home, I called David and told him about the conversation, and he said, "How do you feel?" And I said, "Hopeful maybe, but careful." And he said, "That sounds exactly right." And I realized that unlike my relationship with my mother, where I'd given thousands of chances over decades, this felt different because Madison was actually doing the work, actually examining herself instead of just managing her image. And maybe, just maybe, we could build something real from the ruins of what we'd never actually had. 6 months after my conversation with Madison, I stood in the auditorium at Northwestern University where I'd been invited to present my patient advocacy program's national expansion, and the room held about 200 healthcare professionals and administrators from 17 states. And as I waited backstage going over my notes one more time, David texted me, "You've got this. See you after. Love you." And I smiled because his steady presence had become the foundation I'd built everything else on. And when I walked out onto that stage and looked at all those faces waiting to hear what I had to say, I thought about the woman I'd been 3.5 years ago, terrified and alone in an oncologist's office, and how impossible this moment would have seemed then, and my presentation went well. People asked thoughtful questions about implementation and funding models and patient outcomes. And afterward, during the reception, a woman from Johns Hopkins approached me about adapting the program for their system, and I was talking with her when I saw my mother standing near the back of the room. And my first instinct was annoyance that she'd come without asking, but then I saw her face, and she wasn't performing or positioning herself to be noticed. She was simply watching me with this expression of quiet awe. And when I finished my conversation and walked over to her, she said, "Emma, I had no idea. I mean, I knew about your work, but I didn't understand what it actually meant, watching you up there." And I said, "Did you want to get coffee?" And we walked to a cafe near campus and sat down, and this time she didn't launch into a prepared speech or try to manage the narrative. She just said, "Tell me about your work. Really tell me. I want to understand." And so I did. I told her about the patients I'd met during my own treatment who had no one, about developing the framework while sitting in chemotherapy chairs, about the grant process and the implementation challenges, and the data showing that comprehensive support improved not just quality of life, but actual survival rates. And she listened in a way she'd never listened before, asking genuine questions instead of waiting for her turn to talk. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I failed you, Emma, not just with the surgery, but for your whole life, And I'm not asking you to forgive me or give me another chance. I just need you to know that I see it now. I see you now, and I'm sorry. And the apology felt different this time, less about her image and more about genuine regret. And I said, Mom, I appreciate that, I do. But I need you to understand that our relationship can't go back to what it was because what it was wasn't healthy for me. And she nodded and said, I know, Madison helped me see that in therapy. And I felt surprised and said, You're in therapy? And she said, Family therapy with Madison, individual therapy for myself. I'm trying to understand why I did the things I did, why I couldn't see what I was doing to you. And we talked for another hour, and I realized that while I might never fully trust her,
Might never have the mother-daughter relationship I'd once desperately wanted, we could perhaps have something honest and boundaried, something real even if it was limited. And when we parted, she hugged me and said, I'm proud of you, and I know that probably doesn't mean much anymore, but I am. And I said, it means something, just not everything. And I drove home thinking about how 3 years ago her approval would have been everything I needed to feel whole. But now it was simply a nice gesture from a flawed person I was related to. And when I got home, David was cooking dinner, and Madison was there too. We'd been having regular sister dinners for the past 4 months. And she was telling David about her new job as a financial counselor at a nonprofit helping people manage debt. And I watched them laughing together in our kitchen. This house David and I had bought with money we'd earned and filled with people we'd chosen. And later that night after Madison left, and David was reading in bed beside me, I got up and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, my hair fully grown back now, longer than it had been before I got sick. And I touched my reflection and thought about the journey from that terrified woman in the oncologist's office to this woman who'd built something meaningful from her pain. And I realized that peace wasn't about my mother finally seeing me, or about getting the childhood I deserved, or about any external validation at all. Peace was standing in my own bathroom, in my own house, looking at my own reflection, and knowing without any doubt that I was enough exactly as I was, that my worth existed independent of who recognized it. And the next morning, I woke up early and started drafting a proposal for expanding the program internationally. And David brought me coffee and kissed the top of my head and said, What are you working on? And I said, The next thing. And he smiled because he understood that I'd spent too many years waiting for permission to be extraordinary when I'd had it in me all along. And my phone buzzed with a text from my father saying, Lunch this week? I want to hear about the presentation. And another from Jade saying, Drinks Friday. I'm bringing someone I want you to meet. And one from Madison with a funny meme about therapy. And I looked at all these messages from people who'd chosen to see me, really see me. And I thought about how I'd built this life one small decision at a time, one boundary held, one achievement earned, one relationship honored or released, and how cancer hadn't broken me and my mother's absence hadn't defined me because I'd defined myself, and that was everything.